Give me the thumbs up when you're ready, Joe. All right. Well, welcome again to session 4 of our Will I Believe class. So far, we have talked about why ask the question, why believe? And we said that the Christian claims are so big and so bold that we have to wrestle with them, that there's matters of eternity at stake here. And then, secondly, we said that all of us go through these times in life that cause us to ponder the deep questions of life, such as the loss of a loved one. And so we have to, we can't go by without seeking answers to these deep questions. And then in week 2, we talked about the reliability of the gospel accounts, of how we can know that we truly have a faithful recording of the life and words of Jesus. And we said that if that is true, if Jesus really said the things that the gospel writers say that he said, then we only have 3 options. Either he's a liar, or he's a lunatic, or he's Lord. And then last week we looked at the key event that would determine, or at least Christians say would determine, that if Jesus really did this, that it would validate his claim that he is indeed Lord, and that was the resurrection. We gave arguments for the historicity of the resurrection. So now we are going to move into, we ended last week talking about that when you look at the evidence that pretty much every scholar agrees on that support the resurrection, obviously not everybody believes that the resurrection is the best explanation for that. But we said last week that the reason for that actually has less to do with the evidence itself and has more to do with philosophical presuppositions that people bring to the question of the resurrection. That there are people that say, well, the resurrection couldn't be the explanation for all these bits of evidence because we know that such things as supernatural events don't happen because there is no supernatural being, aka God. That people are presupposing the answer to the question before they ever actually look at the evidence. So this week and next week we're going to look at that question: is does God exist? You know, beyond just the Christian conception of God, does God exist? And there's this interesting phenomenon that a lot of times people will say, and I used to say this myself, that faith and evidence are mutually exclusive. That faith by its very nature is blind faith. It's believing something at the very best without any evidence to support it, or even worse, contrary to the evidence that would indicate otherwise. But what's interesting is when you look at that word faith, and certainly when we look at the Bible and things like the Greek word in our New Testament that's translated faith, it can easily be translated as the word trust. And we all know that trust is based on evidence. So, for example, I trust my wife, perhaps more than anybody else in this world, because we have a history that goes back years upon years upon years that I know my wife to be trustworthy. So my trust, my faith in my wife is based on the evidence, not in spite of the evidence. And the reality is, and people that are intellectually honest and consistent will admit, that very few fields in life are actually based on absolute proof. Basically math, and that's about it. So even the scientists in the room, I believe, I can in good faith assume, would say that there, even in the realm of science, there is no such thing as absolute proof. What we are doing is we are gathering evidence, and then we are deciding what hypothesis most plausibly explains the evidence that we have. And so to hold Christianity, or this question of do we know that God exists, to the standard of proof, isn't really a valid standard, because people, or at the very least, people are being inconsistent with how they apply that standard. So what we want to do in the matter of faith is we want to look at the evidence. So what evidence is there for the existence of God? This week, we're going to look at the evidence from what Christians have historically called natural revelation. In other words, we're going to look at the evidence for God's existence that is observable in the universe. And Shinvi, in his book, Why I Believe, gives 4 key strands of evidence of God's existence from the observable universe. And the first one, speaking of mathematics, is what he calls the success of mathematics in describing our universe. In other words, as we look at mathematical equations, they are the same always, everywhere, forever. 1 plus 1 equals 2, period. It doesn't matter if it's now or 3,000 years ago. It doesn't matter if it's here on Earth or all the way across the universe. 1 plus 1 equals 2. That there are these foundational equations that undergird our universe and are equally true and apply uniformly across the space-time continuum. But beyond just the fact that mathematics is successful in describing the universe, there's also this phenomenon that we as humans are able to understand it. So just the fact that is such a thing as mathematical equations that apply throughout the universe, the fact that we as humans can understand it in and of itself is a pointer to God. Let's talk more about that. So some might say that the idea that math is successful in describing the universe, they could say that it's just a brute fact that we live in an orderly universe, that it just is, and it could be no other way. But is it really that improbable to think? Could we not at least conceive of the possibility of a chaotic, unpredictable universe? And if we can even fathom the possibility, then it seems to indicate that we can't just rely on the brute fact argument. Now, what about our ability to understand mathematics? Some people have come along and said, well, we can explain our ability to understand mathematics because of language. But all that's really doing is kicking the can down the road. That people that really study the origin and the evolution of human language admit that we don't really know. That experts in the field of language will say that the evolution of human language and the development of human language is one of the great mystery of our species. Now, the Christian story has a way of explaining this. It has a way of explaining the order that we see in the universe. The Christian story teaches us that there is a rational, infinitely intelligent creator God. And so this rationality and this intelligence, we can see evidences of it as we look throughout the universe. And of our ability to understand it, the Christian story says that human beings are created in the image of God. And that means a lot of different things. But one of the things that it means is that we are made in some ways like our Creator. So we are made rational creatures and therefore able to understand the order of the universe. At least we have the ability to. So the success in mathematics in describing the universe is one pointer to the existence of God. Another one is the origin of the universe itself. The scientific consensus nowadays is that the universe had a beginning. Scientists, even as recent as about 100 years ago, thought the universe was eternal. It even bothered people like Einstein that as he was discovering things, it seemed to contradict this idea of an eternal universe. Well, now, because of things like the expansion of the universe, the scientific consensus is that the universe had a beginning, that if it's expanding, that means if we rewind the tape of history, it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking to this infinitesimal point that then exploded in what scientists often refer to as the Big Bang. And so some might say, well, of course we can explain the origin of the universe. The Big Bang is the most plausible theory that explains the origin of the universe. But once again, that's merely kicking the can down the road. If indeed there was such a thing as the Big Bang, the next logical question is, what or who caused the Big Bang? Some others will say, okay, well, if you have to ask the question, how did the universe come into exist? They would claim that we're just kicking the can down the road. If God, as Christians would allege, caused the Big Bang, for sake of argument, who caused God? How did God come to exist? But the problem with that question is that it's a category error. That it would be kind of like asking, what is the cause of all the set of even numbers, as Shinvi points out in his book. So it's a category error because the universe began to exist, but God is eternal. It's part of the definition of who and what God is. Others have come along, and as the realm of quantum mechanics and physics, as we're developing these theories, they say, well, they'll appeal to the idea of quantum fluctuations, that there are these pockets of space-time where particles can seem to appear and disappear at random. But those that have studied this field and know the language of the field realize that for someone to claim that quantum fluctuations describe the origin of the universe it's yet another category error, because they are redefining the word nothing, which is what Christians believe, that God created the universe out of nothing, ex nihilo, that they are defining nothing as the quantum vacuum, which, if they were being intellectually honest, would admit that that's not nothing in an absolute true sense, the way that Christians claim God created the universe out of nothing. And then there's the idea that the universe could be eternal. But as we've already mentioned, all of the evidence in the observable universe supports the idea that the universe did indeed have a beginning. And once again, theists, not just Christians, but theists, have an explanation for this evidence, that we have an answer for why or how the universe began. And our answer is that God is the eternal, uncaused first cause who caused the universe to come into being. God is the eternal, uncaused first cause who brought the universe into being. So there's the argument from the origin of the universe. The third argument is the fact that the universe exists at all. Why does the universe exist at all? Whether it was eternal or it had a beginning. And the Christian answer is because God chose to create it. He didn't have to, but out of his goodness and love, he chose to create it. But how do we explain God's existence? If God is the explanation of the universe's existence, how do we explain God's existence? Well, the traditional answer is that God, as we alluded to earlier, is self-existent. His existence is explained by the nature of who he is and what he is, a being who exists necessarily and is completely independent of any other being. Now, some might come along and once again try to use the brute fact argument that the fact that the universe exists is just a brute fact. It just is. But once again, human experience seems to demand otherwise. That we seem to demand explanations for physical things in the way that we don't explain, or we don't demand explanation of non-physical things, that we don't ask ourselves. None of us, I would guess, are have sleepless nights because we're pondering, why do prime numbers exist? Or why do the laws of logic exist? No, they just do. And we as humanity have discovered those things, but we're not sitting there asking ourselves, we're not laying awake at night asking why they exist in the same way that we ask of created things like the universe. People do stay awake at night asking, why does the universe exist? And so we have mathematics, we have the origin of the universe, and we have the fact that the universe exists at all pointing to the existence of God. And then last, and I think one of the strongest arguments, is the fine-tuning argument. That the last strand of evidence is the fine-tuning of the universe for life. Biological life, we talked about mathematical equations undergirding the universe. There's certain constants that mathematicians and scientists have discovered in our universe, things like the strong and weak nuclear force, things like the force of gravity. And as mathematicians and scientists study these things, we discover that biological life would be impossible if any one of these constants was adjusted by even a fraction of a percent. For example, there's something called the cosmological constant. We talked a moment ago about how the evidence is pointing that the universe is expanding, and the cosmological constant is the rate at which the universe is expanding. And the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 1 trillion, 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 trillion. In other words, if that number was adjusted even the slightest percentage one way or the other, we wouldn't exist. That if that force was too weak and the universe wasn't expanding fast enough to overcome the power of gravity, the universe would just constantly shrink in on itself. Or conversely, if that force was just a tiny bit too strong, the universe would expand so fast that we would basically never have anything but hydrogen and helium atoms, because they would never be able to fuse together to make more complex atoms and molecules. So the universe seems to be fine-tuned to life. And the most plausible explanation, Christians would contend, is that there's a fine tuner. That the universe is fine-tuned because there's a fine tuner. As I was reading this portion of the chapter, I was thinking back to my musical background. So if you ever go see an orchestral concert, we know that one of the first things you're going to hear as the musicians come on stage and before the concert begins is you're going to hear the oboist play what we call a concert A. And then all of the other instrumentalists of the orchestra are going to join in, and they're going to tune their instruments to that A. And on the string instruments, we can all probably picture in our mind the pegs at the end of the neck of the instrument. But closer to the musician, there's finer dials called fine tuners. So none of us go to the symphony and wonder how all of these instruments just magically fine-tuned themselves. No, the orchestra plays in tune because each instrument had a fine tuner. And the same is true with the universe. The universe is fine-tuned to support life because there is a fine tuner. One of the most common counter-arguments to this is the multiverse theory. And while it may or may not make for good cinema in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the fact of the matter is that the multiverse theory is merely speculation. Again, what we're looking at today is arguments based on observable facts. So anyone to appeal to the multiverse theory is not basing an argument on observable fact. When we look at the observable universe, all we can plausibly say is the existence of our own universe. And our own universe, as we've been discussing for the last several minutes, supports the idea of a creator. Now, some will come along and say that when we do this, when we look at the evidence that we see and we can't come up with a plausible naturalistic explanation, they say that we are committing the fallacy of the God of the gaps fallacy. The God of the gaps fallacy basically says that of all the knowledge that could exist, humans have only stumbled on little bits of knowledge, and then we have these giant, or sometimes smaller or larger gaps in our knowledge, and that historically what humans have done is anytime there's a gap in our knowledge, then we just put God in that gap. Well, I guess God did it. How do we explain this? Well, this, and this. How do we explain this? I don't know. I guess God did it. So it's the idea that the more we learn, or people that would accuse us of just appealing to the God of the gaps would say that the more that we learn, we find naturalistic explanations for things that were once thought supernatural. But once again, there's a bit of a category error there. As we were just discussing at our table, if you look at the history of science, all of the fathers of modern science were theists. And the way that they understood the discipline of science is that it was the study of how God created and ordered the world. They didn't see science and faith as contradictory to one another. They saw them as complementary to one another. In fact, theoretical chemist Henry Schaeffer said, "The significance and joy in my science comes in those occasional moments of discovering something new and saying to myself, so that's how God did it." Now, there are indeed gaps in our knowledge, and some of those may be filled in with naturalistic, scientific explanations, but the fact of the matter is that there are gaps in our knowledge that will never be filled with a natural explanation. We talked about one of the key examples last week, the resurrection of Jesus. That we looked at the evidence for the resurrection and said that the most plausible explanation is not a naturalistic one, it's a supernatural one. And then lastly, many of those that would accuse us of the God in the gaps fallacy are simply falling into the opposite ditch. They're falling into a nature of the gaps ditch, that they assume that every possible gap in knowledge must have a naturalistic explanation, no matter how contrived or implausible. And that's why, when, as we discussed last week, when things like the resurrection, you get these crazy ideas like the twin hypothesis, that the person that the disciples saw was not the risen Lord Jesus. It was this twin that is otherwise unknown about. That they're grasping for straws because they feel philosophically committed to a naturalistic explanation, when the most plausible explanation would be a supernatural one. Last thing, I think it's important for us to remember that these aren't just arguments, they are sources of wonder. We were discussing at our table a moment ago how several of us, when we look at the world around us, one of the things that fills us with awe and wonder is space. And I think it's right to do that. The psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God. But as Shinvi powerfully says in his book, supernovas are like a dollar store sparkler in God's eyes. So these are more than just arguments. They're sources of wonder. We could go down the list and talk about how every single one of these things is not just a heady piece of evidence for the existence of God, but is absolutely amazing. That the universe exists, that God created it because he wanted to, and that he fine-tuned our universe for us. In closing, I want to read a quote from page 109 of the book. Shinvi writes, "What if all the glories of this universe were meant to lead us to a greater glory that the universe itself cannot contain, but can only reflect? What if nature points beyond itself to the creator of nature? The Christian claim is that it does. None of us should be content with arguments for God's existence until they lead us to gaze in awe at the God who exists." Let's pray. Father, thank you for these few brief moments to explore the evidence from the universe you have created that point to you, not just your existence, but how amazing and glorious you are. Continue to impress these truths upon our minds and hearts, and guide us as we go into our discussion to process more of the things that we discussed today. And help us not only grow in our strength of belief that you do exist, but help us to grow in our awe and wonder at how amazing you are. And we ask this all in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.